There's a photograph from March 30th, 1981, that most people have never really studied. It shows Secret Service agents shoving President Ronald Reagan into the back of a limousine outside the Washington Hilton Hotel. The president's face is visible for just a moment, not in pain yet, not panicked, just confused, like he doesn't understand what's happening. What the photograph doesn't show is the bullet. It had already entered his body, fired from 20 feet away by a man with a .22 caliber revolver. The bullet hit Reagan under his left arm, ricocheted off the limousine, pierced his lung, and stopped less than an inch from his heart. But Reagan didn't know that yet. None of them did. "I think we should go to the hospital," the Secret Service agent said. "I think you've broken my rib," Reagan replied, still not understanding. It wasn't until he started coughing up blood that anyone realized the President of the United States was dying. For 69 days after that shooting, America held its breath while Ronald Reagan fought to survive. Not just the bullet wound, but the infections that followed, the complications, the moments when doctors weren't sure he'd make it through the night. The public saw him joking with nurses, quipping to his wife, Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck." They saw him recovering, resilient, presidential. What they didn't see was the blood loss, the collapsed lung, the moments of delirium, the hallucinations brought on by fever and medication. The night he asked Nancy if they were going to die together. And what almost no one knows is what those 69 days cost him. Not physically, though that was significant, but mentally, emotionally. The way it changed how he saw his presidency, his mortality, his purpose. This is the story of the assassination attempt everyone remembers, but few truly understand. The story of what happened in those moments after the bullet hit, the weeks of recovery no one saw, and the man who emerged from it different than before, convinced he'd been spared for a reason, driven by a sense of borrowed time that would shape the rest of his presidency. If you were an American in 1981, Ronald Reagan represented a fresh start. After the turmoil of the 1970s, Watergate, Vietnam, the Iran hostage crisis, gas lines, stagflation, Reagan promised morning in America. He was optimistic, charming, reassuring. A former movie star who knew how to deliver a line, how to connect with cameras, how to make people believe things could get better. He was 70 years old when he took office on January 20th, 1981, the oldest president ever inaugurated. But he didn't seem old. He had that actor's vitality, that easy smile, that folksy way of telling stories that made you feel like you were sitting on his front porch rather than watching a political speech. He'd been governor of California from 1967 to 1975. Before that, he'd been a Hollywood actor, not a major star, but solid, dependable, the kind of leading man who appeared in dozens of films through the 1940s and 50s. Movies like Newt Rockney, All American, where he played the Gipper, King's Row, and countless westerns. He married his first wife, Jane Wyman, in 1940. They had 2 children, Maureen and Michael, adopted. The marriage ended in divorce in 1949, largely because Jane felt Reagan was too obsessed with politics, and she wanted to focus on her acting career. In 1952, Reagan married Nancy Davis, also an actress. They had 2 children, Patty and Ron Jr. Nancy became his anchor, his protector, his most trusted advisor. She was fiercely devoted to him, sometimes to the point of being controlling, and absolutely convinced that her husband was destined for greatness. Reagan's political career took off in the 1960s. He'd started as a Democrat, but shifted Republican, becoming a spokesman for conservative causes. His 1964 speech, A Time for Choosing, on behalf of Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign, made him a national figure in conservative politics. By 1980, after 2 failed attempts, Reagan won the Republican nomination and then the presidency in a landslide over Jimmy Carter. His inaugural address promised to restore America's confidence, rebuild its military, reduce government, and defeat Soviet communism. He spoke with conviction, optimism, and that signature Reagan charm that made even his opponents sometimes smile. He'd been president for just 69 days when John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots outside the Washington Hilton. One bullet hit Press Secretary James Brady in the head, leaving him permanently disabled. Another hit Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy. Another hit D.C. police officer Thomas Delahanty. And one hit the president. The world watched in horror. Not again, people thought. Not another assassination. Not after Kennedy. Not after the attempts on Ford. Not after John Lennon just 4 months earlier. America couldn't take another loss. But what happened in the minutes, hours, and weeks after that bullet hit is a story few people know completely. The shooting happened at 2:27 p.m. on Monday, March 30th, 1981. Reagan had just finished giving a speech to the AFL-CIO at the Washington Hilton. It was his first major address to a labor group as president. The speech went well. Reagan was in good spirits as he walked out the side entrance toward his limousine. John Hinckley Jr. was waiting in the crowd. He was 25 years old, obsessed with actress Jodie Foster, and had convinced himself that assassinating the president would impress her. A delusion fueled by his obsession with the film Taxi Driver, in which Foster's character is saved by a violent protagonist. Hinckley fired 6 shots in less than 2 seconds. The first shot hit James Brady in the head. The second hit Officer Delahanty in the back. The third went over Reagan's head and hit a building. The fourth hit Secret Service agent McCarthy in the chest. The fifth hit the bulletproof window of the limousine. The sixth ricocheted off the limousine's armored side and hit Reagan under his left arm. Secret Service agent Jerry Parr immediately shoved Reagan into the limousine and threw himself on top of the president. "Let's get out of here," he shouted to the driver. Reagan was confused. "Jerry, what the hell was that?" "Shots fired," Parr said. "Are you hit?" Reagan didn't think so, but his chest hurt. He thought maybe Parr had broken his rib when he shoved him into the car. Parr made a split-second decision. Instead of heading back to the White House, he ordered the driver to go to George Washington University Hospital, just 2 miles away. That decision saved Reagan's life. By the time they arrived at the emergency room at 2:35 p.m., just 8 minutes after the shooting, Reagan was having trouble breathing. He tried to walk into the hospital under his own power. He didn't want to look weak, but as soon as he got through the doors, his knees buckled. He coughed. Blood poured from his mouth. Nurses and doctors rushed him to Trauma Bay 5. They cut off his suit, a brand new blue pinstripe he'd only worn once. They searched for the wound and found it, a small entry hole under his left arm, barely noticeable. But inside, the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had collapsed his left lung. He was losing blood rapidly. He'd eventually lose half his blood volume. His blood pressure was dropping. He was going into shock. "I feel like I can't breathe," Reagan told the doctors. "You're going to be okay, Mr. President," one of them said. Not entirely sure it was true. Reagan looked up at the medical team surrounding him. Even in pain, even terrified, he tried to joke. "I hope you're all Republicans," he said. One of the surgeons, a Democrat, smiled and replied, "Today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans." They wheeled Reagan into surgery at 3:24 p.m. Dr. Benjamin Aaron, a thoracic surgeon, led the operation. They had to remove the bullet, repair the lung, stop the bleeding. The surgery took nearly 3 hours. Outside, America waited. Vice President George H.W. Bush was flying back from Texas. Nancy Reagan was at the hospital, praying, chain-smoking, barely holding herself together. The nation watched television, remembering Kennedy, remembering King, remembering all the violence that had stolen leaders before. At 6:20 p.m., Dr. Aaron emerged from surgery. "The president is going to be fine," he said. America exhaled. But the truth was more complicated than that. Ronald Reagan's recovery became a masterclass in political theater. Within days, he was meeting with advisors from his hospital bed, signing legislation, projecting strength. The White House released photos of him looking presidential in his pajamas, signing documents, smiling. On April 11th, 12 days after the shooting, Reagan walked out of the hospital under his own power. He waved to cameras. He looked thinner, paler, but he was standing. He was alive. "I'm not going to let this stop me," he told reporters, and he meant it. By April 28th, less than a month after being shot, Reagan addressed a joint session of Congress. He received a 12-minute standing ovation. Democrats and Republicans alike applauded, moved by his resilience. The assassination attempt transformed Reagan's presidency. Before March 30th, he'd been a new president with big ideas but little political capital. After March 30th, he was a survivor, a man who'd stared down death and come back stronger. His approval ratings soared. Congress, which had been skeptical of his economic proposals, suddenly became more cooperative. His tax cut package passed. His military buildup accelerated. His vision for confronting the Soviet Union gained momentum. Reagan himself seemed transformed. He'd always been optimistic, but now there was something else, a sense of purpose, of destiny. He told friends and advisors that he believed God had spared him for a reason, that he had a mission to fulfill. He became more determined, more willing to take risks, more convinced that his presidency could change the course of history. But the recovery was far more difficult than the public knew. Reagan had lost half his blood. The bullet had come within an inch of his heart. He'd been in surgery for hours. His body, 70 years old, no matter how vital he seemed, had been through massive trauma. The infections came first, post-surgical complications, fever, weakness, moments when his temperature spiked and doctors worried he might not make it. Then came the psychological toll. Reagan had nightmares, flashbacks to the shooting. He'd wake up in the hospital, disoriented, asking Nancy where he was. The medications caused hallucinations. He later described seeing bizarre, dreamlike sequences that felt real but weren't. He lost weight, nearly 20 pounds in the first 2 weeks. His clothes hung loose. His face looked gaunt, and he was in pain. Constant, grinding pain in his chest, his ribs, his back. The kind of pain that made it hard to breathe, hard to sleep, hard to focus. But Reagan never showed it publicly, never complained. He was determined to project strength, to reassure America that he was fine, that the presidency was stable. Nancy saw the truth. She was with him every day, every night. She saw him struggle to get out of bed, saw him wince when he moved, saw the fear in his eyes during those first nights when he wasn't sure if he'd survive. And she became even more protective, more controlling, more determined to shield him from anything that might hurt him again. She consulted an astrologer, Joan Quigley, to help plan Reagan's schedule around astrologically favorable days. She screened his appointments. She pushed out advisors she didn't trust. She became the gatekeeper, and anyone who wanted access to the president had to go through her. Some staffers resented it, but Nancy didn't care. She'd almost lost him. She wasn't going to let anything or anyone put him at risk again. Reagan's children struggled with it too. His relationship with his kids had always been complicated, warm but distant, loving but not deeply intimate. Patty and Ron Jr., his children with Nancy, felt shut out. His older children from his first marriage, Maureen and Michael, felt even more on the periphery. They'd nearly lost their father, but the crisis somehow made them feel further away from him, not closer, because Nancy controlled access, because Reagan himself was focused on the presidency, on the mission he now believed he was destined to complete. By the summer of 1981, Reagan was back to a full schedule, working, traveling, giving speeches, looking strong. But those closest to him saw the changes, the way he tired more easily, the way he moved a little slower, the way certain things, Loud noises, sudden movements, made him flinch for just a moment before he caught himself. He'd survived, but survival had come with a price. It was late at night, about 2 weeks after the shooting. Reagan was still in the hospital, recovering, unable to sleep. Nancy was in a chair beside his bed, dozing lightly. She'd barely left his side. Reagan looked at her in the dim light. Her face was tired. She'd aged in those 2 weeks. The stress, the fear, the vigil. "Nancy," he whispered. She woke immediately. "What is it? Are you okay? Should I get a nurse?" No, I'm fine. I wanted to tell you something." Nancy leaned closer, taking his hand. "I thought I was going to die," Reagan said quietly. "In the car, when I started coughing up blood. I thought that was it." Nancy's eyes filled with tears. She'd been trying so hard to stay strong. "And all I could think about," Reagan continued, "was that I hadn't finished, that there was so much I still needed to do." "You're going to be fine," Nancy said, squeezing his hand. "You're going to be president for 8 years. You're going to change everything." Reagan smiled. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I know it," Nancy said. Reagan was quiet for a moment. "I think God spared me. I don't know why, but I think he did. And I think I need to figure out what I'm supposed to do with this second chance." Nancy kissed his forehead. "You will? You'll know." Reagan closed his eyes, exhausted but at peace. He'd come so close to dying, but he was still here, and he was going to make it count. The turning point wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, unfolding over months and years. Reagan returned to full presidential duties with a renewed sense of purpose. He pushed his economic agenda, supply-side economics, tax cuts, reduced government spending. Critics called it Reaganomics and predicted disaster. But Reagan was undeterred. He rebuilt the military, increasing defense spending dramatically. He took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union, calling it an evil empire in a 1983 speech that made headlines around the world. He survived because of that bullet missing his heart by an inch, and he interpreted that survival as a sign that he was meant to confront the Soviets, to push for freedom, to win the Cold War. In 1987, he stood at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin and declared, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." 2 years later, the wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, shortly after Reagan left office. Whether Reagan's policies directly caused the collapse is debated by historians, but Reagan himself never doubted. He believed he'd been spared to help end the Cold War, and in a very real sense, he dedicated his post-assassination life to that mission. But the cost of that dedication was steep. His children felt neglected. His health suffered, though he hid it well. By his second term, there were early signs of the Alzheimer's disease that would eventually take his memory, though it wasn't diagnosed until years after he left office. And the trauma of the assassination attempt never fully left him. He rarely spoke about it. But those close to him said he was different after March 30th, 1981. More focused, more driven, more aware of his mortality, and perhaps, because of that awareness, more determined to make his time matter. Here's what people don't understand about Ronald Reagan and the assassination attempt. It wasn't just about the bullet. It was about what that bullet represented, a reminder that life is fragile, that presidents are mortal, that time is limited and shouldn't be wasted. Reagan had always been optimistic, but after March 30th, 1981, that optimism took on a different quality. It became more urgent, more purposeful. He wasn't just president, he was a man on borrowed time, determined to fulfill a mission he believed God had spared him to complete. Did that belief shape his presidency? Absolutely. It made him bolder, more willing to confront the Soviets, more willing to push unpopular policies because he believed he was right. Did it make him a better president? That's debatable. His supporters say yes, that the assassination attempt gave him the moral authority and personal conviction to change history. His critics say it made him more reckless, more ideological, less willing to compromise. But what's undeniable is that the man who walked out of George Washington University Hospital on April 11, 1981, was different from the man who'd been shot 12 days earlier. He'd stared into the abyss. He'd almost died, and he'd come back convinced that he'd been given a gift, a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. Ronald Reagan served 2 full terms as president. He left office in January 1989 with one of the highest approval ratings in modern history. In 1994, he announced he'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. He wrote a letter to the American people saying, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life." For the next 10 years, he slowly faded from public view. Nancy cared for him at their home in Bel Air, California, fiercely protective until the end. Ronald Reagan died on June 5, 2004, at the age of 93. Nancy was by his side. At his funeral, people spoke of his optimism, his vision, his role in ending the Cold War. They remembered the great communicator, the man who made Americans believe in morning again. But perhaps what defined him most was something that happened 23 years earlier, on a sidewalk in Washington, D.C., when a bullet came within an inch of his heart, when he coughed up blood and thought he was dying, and then survived. That survival shaped everything that came after. It gave him purpose. It gave him conviction. It gave him the belief that he'd been spared for something important. Whether that belief was true or not almost doesn't matter, because Reagan believed it, and that belief changed how he led. James Brady, the press secretary who was shot in the head that day, survived too, but was left permanently disabled. He and his wife Sarah spent the rest of their lives advocating for gun control, eventually achieving the passage of the Brady Bill in 1993. John Hinckley Jr. was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent decades in a psychiatric hospital. He was released in 2016, an old man whose moment of violence had changed history in ways he never intended. And Nancy Reagan lived until 2016, 94 years old, carrying the memory of that day and every day after, when she almost lost the man she loved. Some stories aren't about what happened. They're about what almost happened, and how that almost shapes everything that comes after. Ronald Reagan almost died on March 30th, 1981. Instead, he lived another 23 years, led a nation, confronted an empire, changed history, all because a bullet missed his heart by 1 inch. And some stories stay with us forever. If this quiet story touched you, feel free to subscribe and join us for more forgotten American lives.